Yesterday, the Russian ambassador to South Africa, Ilya Rogachev, told an ANC dialogue on the Russia-Ukraine conflict that there was no space for neutrality in the modern world. His argument is that the West would not allow neutrality and would subject a country trying to stay neutral to secondary sanctions. As you know, our government and our governing party, the ANC, says we're following a policy of non-alignment. They say non-alignment is not the same thing as neutrality. At the same event yesterday, the Norwegian ambassador to South Africa, Gjermund Saether, saying Russia did not need to fear NATO, but Russia was really just scared of democracy. Well, Gjermund Saether, Norway's ambassador to South Africa, is with us now. Mr. Ambassador, good afternoon, and thank you for coming in.
No, thank you for having me.
Do you agree with the Russian ambassador that a country cannot stay neutral in the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the modern world?
No, Norway respects the independence and sovereignty and independent foreign policy of all countries. So, of course, countries make their own decisions, and we respect South Africa's choice of being non-aligned, or some say the word neutral, or some say active non-aligned. You know, we fully respect that, and that is, of course, possible to have an own independent foreign policy.
You're a diplomat. Do you believe non-alignment and neutrality are the same thing?
What I think is important is the values and principles in foreign policy. So for us, this whole conflict is quite easy. You know, in Europe we had countless wars. We had First World War, we had Second World War, and the whole idea behind so many of these wars was might is right. I'm a big power, I do as I please. And that also was a problem for Norway as a small country. And after Second World War, we thought we had finished with that. We thought 50 million dead and the UN Charter would secure us. And we got European security arrangement. There was, of course, a lot of issues during the Cold War. But the problem with Russia is exactly that same attitude is still there. We take a piece of Georgia in 2008. We take a piece of Ukraine in 2014. We take the whole of Ukraine, or try to do it in 2022. And there is no one who have tried to invade Russia. Russia is invading other countries. I think that's very clear. So it's very clear that there is one aggressor and there is one victim. The victim is Ukraine. If Russia stops the war, if they pull back to their internationally recognized border, the war is finished now. It's their choice.
Okay. I mean, they have a very different view, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. So, as a diplomat, as someone who watches us very closely, and I realize you will choose your words very carefully, and that's correct, do you think that it's possible for a nation like South Africa to remain non-aligned, or do you think that we would be punished by the West for doing that?
No, I think that's possible. I think that's possible to remain non-aligned. And I think but of course, if you are non-aligned, one have to. It's a difficult world. It's a geopolitical shifting times. And that's why I think values and principles are so important. So active support for the UN Charter, for example, for Norway, that is a key issue. Support for self-determination and independence of nations, that has been with us since we were occupied, since we supported the ANC since the 1960s, up until today when we support Ukraine. Same issue, self-determination, same principles, independence.
I mean, so principles are important. I completely agree with you. They can also be quite expensive. So, for example, lots of countries say they have principles about human rights. Lots of countries say that they want to impose sanctions on countries that help Russia. The Chinese government won't thank me for saying this, but they have issues around human rights, and they support Russia actively, not necessarily in the war, but they actively, you know, have a very close relationship. And yet very few people are looking at imposing sanctions on China. The argument would go that it's okay for the West, which you support, sort of, well, you do, I suppose, to sanction or punish or lecture South Africa, but no one's lecturing China on its support for Russia.
Well, I think we have to be a bit more nuanced maybe when we talk about sanctions, because I'm not representing the U.S., but if the issue is AGOA, that's not about sanctions. AGOA is a very beneficial agreement that the U.S. has made available. It's basically for low-income countries, but they have also allowed South Africa to be part of it, even if it is a middle-income country. So I think if you're referring to possible changes in the status of AGOA, which is really nothing I can say much about, but I think you just have to be a bit nuanced. It's not about sanctions. It's a trade benefit that they have given to South Africa.
You made the point earlier that Russia was the one that had attacked Ukraine. And they say, Russia has said, that NATO was getting sort of closer and closer to its borders. And we can go back to, you know, the end of the Cold War or the end of World War II to look at this. But if a country, and I mean there's a great way of looking at this, that if, for example, there was a Russian NATO and Canada joined a Russian-led NATO, what would the United States do? In South Africa's case, if Eswatini joined a bloc that was seen as hostile to South Africa, what would South Africa do? So the argument would go that South Africa or the United States would say that they have the right to take active measures to protect themselves. That's what Russia would say it's doing now.
No, I think it's a border is a border. And I think that's kind of the basic principle in international relations, respect the borders of countries. And I think that is the problem for Russia. They don't. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, they have still not come to the terms to the fact that they are a very big country, but they still wanted to be bigger. And that's why, you know, when NATO is not expanding. It's democracy that is expanding. So countries are joining NATO because they feel threatened by Russia. So NATO is a defensive alliance. And when countries feel threatened, when they feel that their independence and democracy might be under threat, they want to join NATO. That was Norway's case in 1949. And it's the same with Sweden and Finland now. Nobody thought that Sweden and Finland would join NATO. Russia's action, Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed the calculation completely. So if Russia wanted less NATO, they should not have invaded. They got more NATO as a result of their choices, their war of choice. They choose this war. They didn't have to do this war. Now they get more NATO. It's their mistake.
You put it quite clearly or crisply yesterday when you said, and you sort of almost repeated it now, for Russia the problem is not NATO, the problem is democracy, and they don't want democracy. That's quite a comment to make.
Well, I mean, we see there is no democracy inside Russia. I mean, if you go on the Red Square in Moscow and you say loudly, I want peace in Ukraine, you're going to be put in jail. No human rights. There is no open political space, no transparency. And that's the way it is in Russia. And that's one reason why countries don't want to have strong Russian influence. But that's also the way they look at other countries. When they talk about spheres of influence that they want to be kind of respected, it means that they want to decide over sovereign independent countries in the neighborhood. And that is what 40-plus European countries cannot accept, because we have had enough of it through our history.
There's been huge developments over the weekend with the Wagner Group. And I think an implicit or maybe even an explicit concession or announcement by Russian President Vladimir Putin that the Wagner Group is an instrument of Russia. It is part of Russia. And the Wagner Group's been operating in Africa, on our continent. And you might have seen the report out this week about what they've been doing in the Central African Republic. For us, they do operate at times in Mozambique. What do you think this tells us about how the Wagner Group and then possibly Russia, you know, as a result, has been operating in Russia? I mean, has been operating in Africa. I think a critic would say that this is almost colonialism or neo-colonialism.
Yeah, I think, and if we look at Russia's contributions to African development, I really wonder what it is. It is the mercenaries and the human rights violation that follows, and the killings of civilians that follow with the mercenaries. You know, if you look at the development aid from Norway compared to development aid from Russia to this continent, Russia's aid is like this big. And they are not big on trade either, if you look at Europe or US in terms of trade. So, yeah, I really wonder what is Russia's contribution to development on this continent. And I don't think they are a model for many societies either. And I have seen the Wagner mercenaries myself on this continent. It's not a nice sight.
The ANC's event yesterday that you attended, is it constructive? I mean, sometimes as South Africa, you know, we're South African. We like to think we're a bit special. We like to think that we can talk to anybody. Some of that, I think, is still correct. But to have ambassadors, you ended up debating on a platform where the Russian ambassador was. I don't know how high you had to get permission to do that. Do you think something like that is constructive? Should, as South Africans, as whether it's the ANC or Newzroom Afrika or whoever, should we all be trying to do more of that?
Yeah, I think so. I think you can ask ANC, but I'm first of all very grateful for given the opportunity to be there, and I was grateful to be given the floor. But I think it's very important that you have different viewpoints. And I think you know, when we look at conflicts in Africa, both African and European leaders talk about the importance of an African viewpoint. And it's the same in this case. I think it's very important that South Africans know the European viewpoint, and that is very, very coherent, that is very clear, very united. We don't accept Russia taking bits and parts of Ukraine or any other country. It has to stop. They have to keep it in the borders like everyone else has to.
Mr. Ambassador, I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. Gjermund Saether is Norway's ambassador to South Africa, with you here on Newsfeed this afternoon.